Welcome to Transformative Principal, where I help you stop putting out fires and start leading. I'm your host, Jethro Jones. You can follow me on Twitter at Jethro Jones. Welcome to the Transformative Principal podcast. Today I'm excited to have Al Kingsley on the program. He has spent the last 30 years in the EdTech space and 20 of those as a school trustee and governor. He is co-chairman of the Workstream 4 at the Foundation for Educational Development, an organization developing a framework for long-term vision and sustainable planning in England. Al is also the group CEO of NetSupport Limited, an internationally acclaimed EdTech vendor. As a firm supporter of lifelong learning, he is also a regional apprenticeship ambassador and chair of the Employment and Skills Board for his region's combined authority. As an active writer about all things EdTech, Al is a member of the Forbes Technology Council and sits on the Advisory Council for the Foundation for Education Development. He authored a book called My Secret EdTech Diary, released in July 2021, that is a roadmap to a new way of thinking about technology and education. And we're going to talk about some of that today, but not much of that, because we're going to talk about some other things. So Al, welcome to Transformative Principal. Happy to have you here.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Well, I'm excited to talk with you today because we're going to talk about high-stakes testing, which is one of my favorite and most hated topics ever.
Oh, how exciting.
Yes. So I think that this will be good. So let's first talk about education in the UK is the same but different from education in the United States, which is also the same but different. So tell us a little bit about how things are a little bit different in the UK versus the United States. As you probably know, UK is certainly better than I do.
Yeah, I mean, there's many similarities, frankly, in most education systems around the world. You know, the UK system, we have, and it's changed over the last couple of decades, but in essence, our education system has gone through a transformation. So previously, all of our schools were what were referred to as local authority schools, state-based schools in the national education system. And we introduced an academization program, which basically brings together lots of schools to form, in essence, like a school district, but under independent management, running of those schools, reporting to a regional schools commissioner. So we kind of have two parallel tracks of schools, those run by our local authorities and those run by independent academies. And I suppose, like every region, there's a third stream, which are the independent, the private fees-paying schools that sit in the mix as well. And typically we have our references of primary and secondary. So children for the first 7 years of their education are in a primary school and then move to a secondary. Not exclusively, because there are some that operate a three-tier system just to keep things interesting for everybody else. When it comes to thinking about performance, we tend to have two checkpoints in our primary provision. So at the end of the third year of education, year 2 and then year 6, we have another set. And that's really to gauge those core levels of attainment. And the year 6 measures are what are often used by children when they move into a secondary school to set that baseline of expectation of where they'll progress. Now, given tonight's conversation, you'll be shocked to hear that sometimes there's debate about those two measures, because the first checkpoint halfway through a child's primary journey is done on internal assessment, and the second checkpoint is done on external assessment. So depending on schools and children, sometimes there can be a bit of debate that maybe schools are a bit harsh on the internal assessments to show greater progress before the external assessments, or vice versa.
To make sure I understand, the internal assessment is something that is done within the school, and the external is done something outside of the school. Explain that a little bit more.
So internal assessment is very much about teacher-based assessments based on what they've seen the child achieve within the classroom. At the end of their primary journey, the external assessment is undertaking what we refer to as SATs, but exams, formal assessments that are marked and moderated externally. So like all things, you know, we're often at a very simplistic level, and we'll unpick a bit more. We kind of judge the merits based on how much progress a child makes. So, you know, if you judge them pretty harsh at the midpoint, it's easier to make progress growth. Now, I'm using that as an example to perhaps exaggerate for effect, because like in every system, most schools operate exactly the way it was intended, with best will and best practice. But there's just, sometimes it's open to dispute then, isn't it? And that's the challenge with systems. When we move to our senior schools, our secondary schools, ultimately our children progress through, and the only real measures become their, what we refer to as GCSEs. Children take their formal external exams aged 16 in a range of subjects, and as well as getting grades, now we have two special measures that are produced which are linked to school league tables. So one is Attainment 8, which is really the level of attainment, the grades children achieve based on a comparator against all other children in the country. And one is Progress 8, which is how much progress has a child made from that starting point when they arrived. So see our earlier point about that first external exam in year 6 through to when they took their external exams age 16. And typically we're expecting a child to make 3 whole grade jumps in progress over that period of time. And then 2 years later, they take their final exams before they head off to college or university, which we call A levels. And again, they are an end of period summative assessment. It's an external examination they sit, and then off they go to whatever the next step is in their learning journey and life choice, whether it's the workplace, university, and so on.
So let me ask another clarifying question here, because in the United States, kids take exams at the end of each year, every grade level, starting in 3rd grade, going up through typically 10th grade. Some do 11th and 12th, but mostly it's 3rd through 10th grade, which is year 4 through 11, I believe, compared to how you guys name yours. So are there no end of year assessments at the yearly level?
There are, but they're purely internal. So that's what schools are using to monitor. And as we get closer to the formal external exams, there'll be the mock exams, the practice papers. Throughout the year, there will be different checkpoints terminally where staff will be taking assessment points based on either short, formative tests or based on what they've tracked during the term as well. So we kind of have those key external markers, shall we say, rather than the fact there's an ongoing internal process of assessment.
Yes, so we have ongoing internal processes throughout a child's education from kindergarten through 12th grade. That's always happening. But then for us, those external measures are done yearly, and they are mandated by each state. So each state has their own different way of doing it, though they're all pretty much similar at this point, and there's not a ton of difference. So the reason why we're talking through all this is to say, are these things worthwhile and meaningful, and are they giving us the information that we need? So is there anything else we need to talk about before we move on to that question?
Well, I think it's more about what is the purpose and the outcome of those measures. Now, clearly, we know internal monitoring, staff taking assessment points of a child's progress, allows the member of staff to shape where there may be gaps in learning, areas to revisit. And particularly if we can see gaps across the whole cohort, we can start to talk about areas where we need to revisit parts of the curriculum. There tends to be, in my view, and I for the purpose of this conversation, I'm choosing to be a little bit more black and white or contentious than perhaps I need to be. The question is, when it's an external measure, it only serves 2 purposes, in my view. One is a final marker or certificate for a student's achievement, and we can debate the merits of the validity of that assessment, or it's because we want an external measure to which we can hold a school to account. That's me really simplifying it down. And the challenge is, and we see it in our schools, when we think about the period coming up to our, if you like, our standardized testing that's for external validation, a large part of our time is spent teaching for the test. It's about practicing the format of taking tests, building student confidence taking the tests, revisiting the subjects for the test. And I guess, like all things, the balancing point is how much time do we spend teaching for the test versus that time could be spent teaching learning and skills and a broader curriculum. And so it's that kind of point where this conversation comes, where we could probably sit back for the next 3 or 4 hours and talk about this, Jethro. But where this really kind of unpicks then is, in the UK, we end up with schools publishing their grades. They get put on the local news for all the schools in the region and national league tables. And the question has to be, what do we hope to achieve by that? Now, there's a really good rebuff argument straight away, which is because parents want choice. I want to send my child to the best school. And it's hard to argue against that at a simplistic level, because as a parent, yes, I wanted to know my child was going to a good school. But then the measure is, are those results where they are in terms of attainment because the school were really bad at teaching a broad and balanced education? Was it a particularly challenging cohort in that particular year? Were there other factors that actually meant that that cohort may have got lower grades than other schools in the area, but actually performed quite well based on their baseline when they joined the school? And then we kind of think, well, if we see a school sits near the bottom, how does that help strive improvement? Well, we can have the message of, hey, you need to improve and do more, but actually it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because actually what we see, we have an extra layer in the UK where we have our external inspections, when the inspectors turn up and do their deep dive of a school's performance and give you a rating. Are you outstanding, good, requires improvement, and so on. But actually, if you get a badge which is not a particularly good badge, requires improvement, actually one of the hardest things is to then recruit staff to come and teach your school, because staff don't want to come to a school that's shown to be, in need of improvement or in challenge. They want to move to a good school. Many staff do. I shouldn't use an all size fits, on that measure. But actually, that badge can sometimes not actually facilitate improvement at all. It can actually hinder.
So let's pause
Yeah.
there for just a second, because I think you said a couple important things. So the external assessment served two measures. You mentioned that we say that this kid completed something, therefore they can move on to the next thing, or hold accountability. Now, Nick Fisher, who I've had on the podcast, said that test scores are legislatively convenient because they allow the legislators, the governing body, to say whether or not a school was good or bad or whatever, as you're talking about right now. And so we judge the school based on the score, but we forget about all those other things that make up what the school is and whether or not it's good. Now, here in the United States, every house you look at buying has at the bottom of the house listing the schools that are in the area and how good or bad they are, and that is almost purely measured on their test scores and not anything else about the school, because again, it's convenient to be able to say this score has 90% or 50% of its students who are successful on the end of year exams.
Yeah, and I would use that analogy and push it back the other way, Jethro. And again, I'm using it slightly extreme for the purpose of us having our conversation. In the same analogy, I would say, so would you choose the right house to buy simply by a listing of the number of rooms and size of it? Or would you also place value on its view and its surrounding area and the accessibility of roads? Because one of the biggest debates at the moment is whether, and this doesn't matter whether we're looking in the US perspective or internationally, things like the PISA measures, is whether our measure of a successful education is acquisition of knowledge, or whether our measure of a successful education is acquisition of knowledge, of course, to provide context, but also acquisition of skills, of social independence, of developing our own robustness, our sense of purpose, our inquisitiveness to learn. There are so many other areas that come under that sense of empowering a young person to flourish in the future. And yes, you're absolutely right. Some of these things become quite intangible. It's a bit like saying, is this school doing really well because it's retaining all of its staff? Well, increasingly, that's a real challenge in schools, losing quality staff. So when we look at our strategic plan, we look at staff retention as being something that's really important. But we're always naturally programmed in education when we measure a school's success to focus in on academic attainment, as opposed to that plus. What about well-being? What about social, emotional, mental health of our learners? What about the breadth of curriculum? When I think back to my school days, and I don't think I'm particularly unique, I don't particularly remember my math or English classes or my grade papers, but I do remember drama, music, sports, other activities, field trips where I went exploring with the school or stayed away from home for the first time. Now, those alone are not going to equip me for an adult life and moving forward, but they absolutely are part of building and developing a love of learning and being inquisitive and developing more. And then we've got this extra bit, which is where PISA now are starting to look and think we need to start to shift the dial, which is actually we don't get to pick the rules in education. It's convenient from a government perspective, but the workplace has shifted significantly, particularly the last 2 years.
Yeah.
And our job is to educate young people for the future workplace so they can contribute to society, be fulfilled, and so on. Now, if the workplace is suddenly moving to actually, there's a greater weighting now on digital skills, communication skills, empathy, all the different things that allow us to engage effectively with our peers in the workplace, whether it's to research and inspire the next generation, to innovate within the companies in technology. All those skills sit in addition to just simply having a base acquisition of knowledge. And so those have to fit into what a school needs to teach. And many schools do. But my point about when we focus in on those kind of the key testing is that doesn't really get much weighting, if any. And so where I might argue to make the debate really simple, you know, those kind of real high stakes tests should go. What I really mean is actually they shouldn't count for everything. There's actually much more to that. And there have been in the UK qualifications for children post 16, where rather than study for 2 years and take those external exams at the end and get a certificate with a grade, you would actually do project work, and each piece of the project work would be marked, and it would count in total during those 2 years for 70% of your score, followed by an exam at the end that counted for 30%. And in essence, all our conversation at the moment is about inclusivity, accessibility for all our learners, recognizing that people and children learn in different ways. And that when we come to testing success in a chosen subject, there's no flexibility whatsoever. And I believe there should be. So rather than saying we shouldn't have those assessments, because of course we need to find out some way of evidencing progress and knowledge being retained, not just for a week, but actually becoming embedded. And we want to measure that teachers are hopefully covering the right content and subjects in their lessons. It's really about shifting that balance to, well, now surely we want to find other ways to capture a child's learning journey, not just the knowledge retention.
Yeah, and knowledge retention is important, but
Absolutely.
knowledge application, I think, is even more important. And being able to assess that, for example, through projects or other activities or interactions one-on-one, I think is way more valuable than, just being able to recall information. And so I see this on a spectrum of information is out there, and knowledge is having that information in your mind, but wisdom is applying that knowledge to your life and what you're doing. And because life has become so much more collaborative in so many professions, the idea of you being the sole source of information as we teach in school is not really as valuable as it may have been in the past, because you can look things up so quickly, you can have resources at the tips of your fingers to get the information, and it's not as needed in all areas as it was before, though there are still areas where you have to have that information. I don't want my doctor, for example, doing surgery
Exactly.
and looking up in the textbook which one's the spleen again. Let me get a picture of that. That's just not gonna work.
Yeah. It's all about the balance, isn't it? I mean, because there's an interesting TED talk from a few years ago. Shigata Mitra was doing a TED talk and about how children will find it. It was a hole in the wall project with a computer in a wall in India, and how young children with no education or experience, given enough time, figured it out. But the start of the talk was basically knowledge is dead. In other words, in the matter of the last 15 years, we've developed technology that means any knowledge we want, we can just go, hey Siri, and we'll get the
Mm,
answer. Now, of course, in reality, no, it's not at all, because that bit of knowledge we talk about is what provides the context for you to then go and understand, find out more, and start to validate, challenge information. But, I think it's like a young person. We can talk about our youngest learners. What's more important, being, having read 3 different books, or focusing on developing a love of learning? Now, clearly, we've got to equip children with the skills that facilitate learning, the reading, the writing, the numeracy, the literacy, and so on. But we also, at the same time, measure some schools by the environment. You like myself, been into many schools, and some schools inspire more than others. That's probably a diplomatic way of saying it. The
Yes.
space, the environment, the people will inspire that love of learning. And yet there's no measure for that in anything other than at the end of it of saying, well, what did this cohort achieve in their grades? And every cohort's different, but also what we don't want is just people that leave at the end of the exams period, completely disillusioned with education. Well, I've crossed the finish line. Now that's it. I'm never going to pick up a novel again in my life. We want people that actually are inspired to be lifelong learners, to always be inquisitive. And I also think over the last couple of years, you've had all sorts of debates and disputes over political process over the last couple of years. Here in the UK, we've had all sorts of debates and disputes about our place in Europe. But one of the common themes has been actually finding out what information is true and valid, and where to find information and how to challenge it for ourselves. Mm-hmm. And those are all skills that, again, I don't see being measured in that broader picture. So I don't think it really matters whether we're talking about your NAP, the kind of the annual measure, whether it's PISA that's being done, whether it's looking at other school systems. Reality is this thing about, are we, because it's convenient, focusing on that measure that we can use to hold a stick over, versus actually looking at what's best for the young people? And my argument to push back, to challenge against it, was if you look at some of the assessment outcomes, and you can absolutely do it from a US perspective. And I was looking over the last 20 years for grade 8 reading using the National Assessment of Education Progress results data. And what was interesting was, for the period for the last 15 years, pretty much every 3-year measure, there was 15 to 16 jurisdictions in the US that were performing below, significantly below the national profile. In 2017, there was 18, maybe just a blip. But my point really of just picking that data, because let's be honest, our ability to consume information and read over a period like that, is there any evidence that by doing this, it is driving up school standards? Does this actually serve a purpose? And that often is that big challenge. Is it providing an ability for us to say they're good, they're bad, full stop? Or are they saying it's identifying they're bad, therefore there's going to be something that we can evidence has a positive impact and improve on it? And sometimes we could say at a very simplistic level, okay, well, I don't always agree, but hey, internationally, we know which are the high-performing school systems around the world. We might debate what the measure of high performing is, and with the current mindset, we might say actually academic is not the sole measure on that process. But what does it achieve? Well, if it signposts who to go talk to learn more, then I guess that's a fair tick in the box. But if it's simply a case of those at the top can smile and say we're doing a great job, and those at the bottom are saying, well, we'd love to do that, but we can't afford to, or in our country that's as good as we can do right now, I question its purpose. It's a little bit like in class, if you want to pick the top 3 winners, well, highlight the top 3, but you don't list those right at the bottom. There's right. A kind of a shift. And again, I'm simplifying for the purpose of our conversation. If we had a system in the UK, for example, we said, well, every school that performed below a certain baseline, the following year got an extra 20% funding so they could use it to recruit teachers or extra resources to intervene, you'd say, okay, well, that helps. Although you'd have a bit of an up and down roller coaster. You'd have schools struggling, getting loads of money and extra resource, performing well, the funding stops and they slip back down again. But at least you'd have a path. But we don't really have that opportunity.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what happens here in the United States, that when a school performs poorly, they get a lot of extra money to be successful. But then they're in this perpetual getting money phase, which actually, because of COVID, has just kept everybody in those positions, and nobody's really changed out of them because we haven't had test scores and all that kind of stuff, which is what we typically use to measure. But what happens is that if your school is a low performing school, you're actually incentivized to be low performing so you can get the extra money so that you can then increase your scores. But if you increase your scores, then you're going to lose that money and not continue to get that. And so there's some challenges around that principals that I've talked to are like, if we do much better, then we're going to lose this money, and then we're not going to be able to sustain it. And that's a very real issue.
I think there's a number of things we have to kind of consider there, which is one of the biggest challenges we have in education around the world is that most of our educational decisions are often taken within political cycles. Governments want to spend new initiatives and they want to see the results before the next election. And that's not unique to any one country. And often decisions about interventions follow a similarly narrow focus. Whereas in reality, we know, and I'm going to use the transformative word, which you know way better than I do, but the transformative word of, if we're going to invest in change in a school, it's rarely a 1 or 2 year fix. It's often, you've got to be thinking a 5-10 year plan. The same as the broader education system. Think of the time it takes a child to pass through the education system. We don't want quick change. We want long-term embedded and evidence change. So when we start thinking longer term, rather than this idea of, when you do badly, we'll give you some money. When you do well, we're going to penalize you and take it away again, which basically allows you to make short-term decisions, but never be able to spend on long-term investment because you can never guarantee that continuity. What's far more meaningful is to think about what are the indicators that might vary the funding for different schools. So when we think about schools, so I'll use obviously England as my home example. Do we say that every school gets the same amount of funding for every child across the country? Well, no, we provide a bit more funding for schools in London because the cost of recruiting and staff salaries is higher. And in the US, we could pick different states and the same applies in terms of the costs. But we also look at much broader measures. So we look at things like social deprivation. There's an index that's produced every 5 years for each region, and it looks at the levels of deprivation for the catchment for where your student cohort comes from, and your funding, you get additional funding. We look at the cohort that indicate things like they have English as an additional language, and there's additional funding to support those. There's funding for children with special educational needs, and again, there's an additional top up there to provide those extra supporting interventions. And all those things allow schools, based on their area and their cohort, which, let's be honest, is unlikely to magically change within a year or two. It'd be a very gradual change in terms of intake of students, to have funding to make more long-term interventions, recruit specialist staff that can provide that additional wraparound care or support, or have extra assistance in the classroom to support and nurture with young people. And that for me is more sustainable. I think we'd probably say, if we went into most schools around the world, schools would say, well, these systems are great, but there's still not enough money in the pot. There's still the pressures. But if I flip and put my hat on from a government perspective, we can't always say the reason a school's not performing well is because it doesn't have enough money. It's probably likely it's a factor. But with the best will in the world, bad leaders can spend a lot of money and still not achieve outcome.
That's right.
And good
Very
leaders
true.
sometimes manage to achieve amazing things with very limited resources. So money alone is not the fix. It's also about the strategic approach, the leadership style of the school, the structures, the prioritization. And in some regard, we're maybe the slightly more positive part of this conversation, we're starting to mitigate that more, because compared to 10 years ago, we've got way more opportunity to share resources, best practice, guidance, and all the rest of it that feeds into it. And that, to me, is far more transformative than getting a score on the door at the end of the year and saying I'm better or worse than the school down the road.
Well, and here's another wrinkle to that, is that each school has its own culture and systems and structures that help it be successful or not. And so you can't just copy what somebody else does and say, this is going to work now at my school, because it's just not possible. So this is, I think, the biggest challenge that we face is, you could say, all right, because we saw that this particular school did well, every school needs to follow this example and do these same kinds of things. But you can't say that, and you can't get that same success from the same school or from a different school using the same practices. And so that really complicates, but it doesn't make it impossible. But it helps you say, what are the things that really matter in making improvement and growth for our students?
I think this is the point where we just have to, and we've seen it particularly the last couple of years, we just actually have to respect first and trust our school leaders. Because we saw in nation around the world, a prescriptive handbook in frankly, 2 sides of paper. This is what you should do for remote learning. And that exact model was, Well, that depends surely on the digital skills of your teacher, your student, and more importantly, the cohort of learners as to whether having a fully synchronous day prescribed on Teams or Zoom all day long was even closely practical. There were many cohorts where 15 minutes of attention span followed by some project work was far more appropriate. And again, you couldn't follow this one, everybody follow this mandate. But I do think lots of these things come back to who knows our learners best. Do we trust our teachers? They've trained, they've qualified, they give up their time to support these young people. And in a way, we say, you see this child every day, you observe what they know, you do those quick assessments to make sure that they're on track and understanding things. And then at the end of it, we kind of say, but we don't trust your judgment, so we'll get somebody else to tell us how well they've done. And it's a little bit like, in many other professions, that would be seen as hugely disrespectful. Now, you've got to have checks and balance in any system. I'm not for a moment suggesting that autonomy is such that you just leave a school to it and never have any kind of checks and balances or, doing, as we try and do, we often benchmark between schools where teachers will move between different schools and do a quick dip and benchmark test on assessed scores to make sure that we're following similar standards and approaches. But we seem to have moved away to the point of saying, well, no, that approach of teacher assessment isn't appropriate. Of course, until last year, when, because of the pandemic in the UK, the exams process was disrupted. And then magically we said, actually, teacher assessed grades, yes, they're perfectly reasonable. We'll use those for this year's national results. But then still the government position is we've done teacher assessed grades. They were probably overly generous the sooner we get back to external exams. Now, were they overly generous? Were teachers just giving all their children extra marks? I don't believe so. Most teachers are very professional in their approach. Or was it perhaps that measuring a child's knowledge, skills acquisition, progress during the last couple of years was actually a fairer measure by observing them over the 2 years than sticking them with a test paper for 2 hours and expecting them to regurgitate as much as they could? I would argue if you put 5 children into an exam hall ready to take a formal exam, for all those that will do well, there'll be children that are nervous, that underperform, will be stressed, or on the day just aren't perfect. But actually that levels out when you're doing assessment in the classroom. So for me, that's why I think an external validation test is fine, but it shouldn't be that's your success or fail. It should be just but one part of that overall journey.
Yeah, and I agree with that, and I think that's important, and I think that it needs to be a much smaller part than we give emphasis to it now. So here in the United States, at the time we're recording this, a lot of kids are graduating, and I've been talking to a lot of parents about their kids' high school journeys, and a lot of parents have said, because of these last 2 years, we just want to make sure that she gets that diploma that says that they completed high school, and we're willing to do whatever needs to be done to get that to happen. We'll bug the teachers to make sure their grades are up high enough. We'll help them as much as we can with homework, sometimes even doing their schoolwork for them to ensure that they get what they need to do to get that diploma. Here in the United States, that diploma is increasingly less valuable, but still essential for almost every job that is out there. And if you don't have it, then you then have to get a GED, which is I don't remember what it stands for, but it's basically a way to get a high school diploma without getting the high school diploma. You basically have to take a test, which is even more challenging for someone who hasn't been successful in school and on their assessments. And there really isn't an alternate path there for kids who have been struggling. And so it's been really fascinating to hear how much emphasis has been put on just doing whatever they can to make sure those kids get their diplomas, when it's becoming less and less valuable because fewer and fewer jobs are accepting that as a highest level of education.
It's a reflective of the system. I mean, sometimes you just pause and you kind of try and zoom out a little bit for that helicopter view. And you think, if we're really, as a nation or internationally, trying to convince ourselves that the best way to measure someone's knowledge and progress over a couple of years is to take a test at the end of it, why is it when we go into the workplace that we're appraised each year on our performance and not asked to sit down and take a test? We don't consider it an appropriate measure in exclusivity alone once we leave the education system. So again, it's about finding that sweet spot. And of course, what happens, like you say, is if we're taking a test that doesn't change, and fundamentally the content and the assessment process hasn't changed for years, then it's not a surprise that it becomes less and less relevant to the workplace. And often when we look in the workplace, we now see that often in the UK, we have an apprenticeship scheme where often a student can leave school, and rather than going to college, they can go into the workplace, work for 3 years, acquiring skills and qualifications whilst at work. And at the end of the 3 years, they're further up the pathway than the child that chose to go to college for 3 years, get their qualification, and then join the business. And suddenly we're not starting to see, why is that? Well, actually, the skills that we're acquiring in the workplace, or those additional broader skills, those cognitive skills, social emotional skills, they're actually the things that we're starting to put more weight on in the workplace, the things that are actually more important about an individual's ability to be successful. It doesn't diminish the fact we all need to be literate and numerate, and we all need to have that baseline of understanding. And of course, in school, developmentally, we learn all those social skills and the sharing and the team building and working, all the other bits. But it's about the fact that surely we need to keep changing that measure to reflect what are now the important skills. I mean, it's doubly hard because actually, unless you've got a crystal ball, none of us can know for sure what the skills are that are needed for the workplace in 10 years from now. Exactly. We're just following a trajectory and trying to second guess what we think is most important, and I think that's kind of where, for me, we're just too rigid. One of the things I referenced earlier on about that TED talks Sugata Mitra was doing, and he was referring to the English education system. And we've got a fair bit of history in England, and some of our earlier history is less popular than others, but like all countries, we follow our history back. But was talking about the UK and the British education system back over the last century and a half, and that it was intended that it was a very fixed curriculum about those writing skills, reading skills, and numeracy, so that anybody who was educated across the British Empire could be picked up and dropped in another part of the British Empire and would have the skills to contribute. And we think about sitting in offices, the ledger writing, the kind of key skills. And that system because it was consistent and could be applied anywhere, that standard made it really easy to measure and maintain. And in many ways, we've never broken out of that mindset of actually consistency and ease of measure somehow trumps the real breadth and accuracy and effectiveness of the measure, because it would just get a bit too complicated. So we've gone for the simple approach, even though it's fundamentally flawed.
Well, and the other part of that is that those key skills have grown over time, when if we just kept them at that minimum level, I think that would actually be a lot better. And so one of the things that I say all the time is, no matter what, a kid needs to be able to read. And if they can read, then they can do anything else in the world. Now, if that's all we do in education, we've actually done a great service to that child and helped them be able to access any kind of text that they come across. And I think that's really valuable. So if we just stop there, that would be sufficient for a very basic level of education. Now, if we add in numeracy and some math skills, then that is even better, because then they can do more and be better. But the problem is that we kept saying, well, we probably should add on chemistry and biology and integrated sciences and earth sciences and all these different things that maybe are beneficial for everybody to have a cursory knowledge of, but they certainly aren't necessary for everybody to have a cursory knowledge of. Even though that's really nice to have, it's not the thing that, when you talked before about what is it that we can see about the future, well, one thing everybody's going to need to be able to do is to learn what has changed and how to adapt to that. And really, to me, that becomes the ultimate skill. Learning and adapting to the change makes you ready for anything. And if nothing changes, then you're good for what you've been able to do up to that point. But that's a completely different way of assessing whether or not kids are learning, is measuring learnability and adaptability.
There's an interesting built around that, and I absolutely support your view in terms of those core building blocks. And the more you try and expand it, the more unrealistic and unattainable it becomes to have value. Building on that PISA type measure of high performing school systems, Michael Stevenson, who's at the OECD, has done some great work, and he's been working on with the Centre for Strategic Education on a model for education for human flourishing, which immediately resonates a bit more with me. But what was interesting, apart from there, what are we going to measure? Some of the key skills that they identified as high performing were built around what you said: adaptive problem solving, ethical decision making, and the one that really resonated with me, aesthetic perception, which sounds a bit grand. But when we think about those key building blocks, we all get the problem solving and making right ethical decisions. But actually, things like, why do we look at a painting and actually go, wow, or a view? That actual sense of how do we put things in context, appreciate what's amazing around us, and share that kind of broader measure. And I think one of the challenges is we've got this focused academic measure, and what we're really now building on is much more of this. Actually, the knowledge gives you part of the jigsaw puzzle, but if you've got the skills to inquire and challenge, and you've got the critical thinking to actually think, is that right? Is that appropriate? What more do I need to do to validate it? And at the same time, in terms of the broader human being, the person who actually enjoys learning, enjoys education, that missing little bit of magic pixie dust you need to sprinkle on it is that aesthetic appreciation. What makes you go, wow, that's an amazing book. Wow, look at that view. That painting's amazing. That musical performance was so overwhelming. There's another element, which is about we actually need to make sure that part of what we do at the end of the education journey at school is not that everybody's exhausted and have completed the task to get that certificate, to get them to the next stage, but actually leaves valuing the experience.
Yeah.
And that's a really difficult one. I mean, how you measure that? Well, there must be, well, I'm sure there's plenty smarter people than me. I don't know. But internally within your own school, your school leadership get a real good sense of the vision and values of what the school does. But when you start trying to measure and encapsulate that, but actually I would hold that most parents would, if you could bottle it and you could measure it, I'm sure most parents would say, you know what, if my child is going to leave their education with a real passion and love and 10 plus happy years of learning, I'd sacrifice a grade over a child that never wants to do that ever again, but just got that extra point on their grade. Yeah. Now, maybe that's simplistic, but that's kind of part of, we have an obligation looking forward to think about the bigger, not just to focus on the narrow.
Yeah, absolutely. So in closing, Al, what is one thing that you would suggest to add, change, or remove from our current testing situation? What would you say, if we could do nothing else, what would be the one thing you say we do?
Well, the most important thing is test less. The second thing, and again, not particularly grand or surprising after our conversation, is don't make the test the 100% of the assessment. Trust teachers would be absolutely there. And then I think you've made a really relevant point. And it's very easy with some of my comments to want to keep adding much more broader measures in. But actually the best effective way of testing, because you've got to do some, is to keep it really narrow on the core skills so that you're not trying to measure too many things and too much time is training for the test. Focus on those key skills that are the facilitators to self-empower a young person to do the next step themselves and have more time to broaden the curriculum. In my role leading multi-academy trust here in the UK, I absolutely say, I think one of our core measures of success is the breadth of curriculum choices we offer, because then we're bound to provide more that will suit across our full cohort. Whereas conversely, the government pressure has been to narrow and narrow and narrow, focus on those core traditional topics, which marginalizes and doesn't play to the strengths of all of our learners, particularly around the arts and humanities.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the question that I would ask a teacher, if a teacher was listening to this, and I'm talking to principals, go ask your teachers this. How can you narrow down everything that kids are supposed to learn in the year in your course or in the semester? How can you narrow that down to one, maybe two questions to see if they really got it? In my English language arts courses that I taught, my question was, are you a better communicator than you were before, and how do we know? And if you can be a better communicator because of an English language arts class, then I think that I've met my goal. Middle and high school language arts, for example, are not about learning how to read. They're more about learning how to think, reason, and communicate. And so to be an effective communicator, you have to be able to think and reason. And then you also have to be well read. So all of those things build into that effective communication. And that's where I would narrow that down as an example. But take that for any class, chemistry, math, doesn't matter. Ask that one simple question. How could you know that they learned what they were supposed to in just one question? I think that would make a big difference as well.
I like that. There's that kind of 3-2-1 model. 3 things you've learned, 2 things that you would like to follow up or find more about, 1 thing that you didn't understand. That kind of different people phrase it different ways. But yeah, you're right. The less questions, the better, I suppose. So my example is probably not as succinct. Clearly, you're lucky I didn't say the 50, 49, 48 system. It would have been even more onerous.
Yeah. Well, Al, this is great talking to you. I appreciate it. Everybody, if you want to learn more about Al, you can get his book, My Secret EdTech Diary, which is a great book. And then you can check him out at Al Kingsley, ALKINGSLEY.com for more information. Al, thanks so much for being part of Transformative Principal today.
My pleasure. Always happy to chat with you.